The crystal chandeliers of the private dining room in Buckhead were still glittering above my parents' 40th anniversary celebration when my father raised his wine glass and quietly erased me from the family in front of 9 relatives. I had been sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table for almost 2 hours, wearing the simple charcoal dress I always wore to family events, playing the same background role I had been assigned since I was 8 years old. The dessert plates had just been cleared. My father, Garrison Whitlock, smoothed the lapels of his custom Italian suit and tapped his silver fork against the rim of his crystal goblet, and the entire room turned toward him with the practiced attention of people who had been trained for decades to listen when he spoke. He smiled the broad, expensive smile he reserved for business announcements and toasts. "Margot and I have something we have been wanting to share with the whole family for weeks," he said, his voice booming with the kind of authority that came from 40 years of never being told no. To celebrate 4 decades of marriage, and to celebrate the absolutely incredible success of Tanner's new technology venture, we are taking the entire family on a 2-week, all-expenses-paid vacation. We have reserved 4 private villas at a 5-star resort on the western coast of Maui. We fly out next Friday morning. Personal chefs, daily spa service, private sunset cruises, the entire experience. The table erupted in cheers. My younger sister Bryn clapped her hands together so loudly her diamond bracelets rattled. My aunts and uncles raised their glasses. My brother-in-law Tanner leaned back in his chair and grinned like a man accepting an award he had personally arranged. I smiled along with everyone else for several seconds, because that was what I always did, and then I quietly slid my phone out of my handbag to check my work calendar. I had 3 open audit cases waiting on my desk and 1 ongoing penetration test for a Fortune 500 client that I would need to formally hand off if I was about to disappear for 14 days. "That sounds wonderful, Dad," I said as the applause faded, keeping my voice light and warm. "What time does our flight depart on Friday?" "I just need to give my office enough notice to wrap up a few final audits before I leave town." The warm air in the private dining room cooled by 10 degrees in less than a second. My father lowered his wine glass slowly to the white tablecloth, the heavy crystal making a soft thud against the wood. The smile vanished from his face. "You do not need the flight time, Sloane," he said, in a flat, cold voice that traveled the entire length of the table. "Because you are not part of us. You are not flying to Hawaii with the rest of the family. We need this trip to be a celebration of people who are actually moving forward in life. You can stay behind in Atlanta and look after your sister's 3 children while the adults are gone. Someone has to be responsible for them, and you are the obvious choice." The silence that followed his sentence was absolute. 9 relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Not a single aunt or uncle opened their mouth to object. My mother, Margot, took a small, delicate sip of champagne and looked vaguely bored by the entire situation, the way she might have looked at a piece of furniture she had decided not to buy. Tanner saw his opening and took it, the way he always did. He leaned forward across the table, resting his elbows on the linen and rotating his wrists slightly, so the gold Rolex he had bought 8 months earlier caught the chandelier light. He smiled at me with the kind of practiced condescension I had learned to recognize from corporate executives I had personally helped put under federal investigation. "Come on now, Sloane," he said, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who had never once been told to behave. "You are 33 years old, completely single, working that little desk job, no real life to speak of outside of it. You have all the free time in the world. Bryn and I genuinely need a vacation away from your depressing energy, and the kids need somebody, so just be a good aunt and do your job for once." Bryn tossed her perfectly styled hair over one shoulder and nodded along with her husband, picking up the rhythm without missing a beat. "Honestly, Sloane," she added, her voice carrying the bored sweetness she reserved for moments when she was being publicly cruel, "you would just bring down the entire mood in Maui anyway. The kids actually like you in small doses. Use the time." I let my eyes drift slowly around the table, watching every single relative refuse to meet my gaze. My aunt was studying the rim of her water glass. My uncle was suddenly very interested in his napkin. My mother lifted her champagne flute again and looked through me as if I had become transparent at some point during the dessert course. They were all waiting for me to do what I had always done: shrink, apologize for inconveniencing them, accept the role they had assigned me at age 9, and never updated since. What none of them knew, sitting around that mahogany table congratulating each other on their generosity and their success, was that the woman in the simple charcoal dress at the far end of the room had spent the last 48 hours quietly auditing every digital footprint connected to their carefully manicured lives. I was not a tech support drone fixing printer jams in some windowless office, the way my parents had decided to describe my career to anyone who asked at the country club. I was a senior corporate security auditor at one of the top financial intelligence firms in the country. My job was to hunt down corporate financial fraud, penetrate encrypted offshore networks, and find the digital footprints of executives who had grown comfortable believing nobody was ever going to look closely at what they had built. I already knew exactly whose stolen money had paid for Tanner's gold Rolex. I took a slow, deliberate sip of ice water, letting the condensation on the glass cool the tips of my fingers. I looked directly into Tanner's eyes first, then I slid my gaze to my father at the head of the table, and finally to my mother, who was still pretending to be interested in her champagne flute. I let a calm, ice-cold smile spread across my face. The kind of smile I usually saved for the moment, in a corporate investigation, when I realized the target was about to discover I had been inside their network for 6 months. "Of course," I said quietly, my voice perfectly smooth and absolutely free of any audible emotion. "I will happily stay behind and look after the children." My father nodded once with satisfaction and reached for the dessert menu. The conversation around the table moved on, as if nothing important had just happened. If you are watching this right now, and that scene at the dinner table just hit a familiar nerve somewhere in your chest, please subscribe to the channel before the next chapter starts, because what comes next is the kind of payback that only happens when the wrong person finally stops apologizing. Down in the comments, tell me about the last time someone in your family or workplace publicly underestimated you in front of a room of people who chose not to defend you. You do not have to share the entire story. One sentence is enough. Your sentence may be the proof a stranger needs that they are not the only one in the room being slowly written out of their own life. To understand why my father felt completely safe humiliating me in front of 9 relatives over crystal goblets and chocolate torte, you have to understand the careful 15-year campaign that had made that moment feel ordinary to everyone at the table. My parents had spent the better part of 2 decades publicly framing me as the family disappointment. My older sister Bryn had been crowned the golden child somewhere around her 7th birthday, and from that point forward, every conversation about the future included her name and excluded mine. When I graduated near the top of my class in computer science, my mother told her bridge club I had chosen a sad little technical field because I could not handle anything more sophisticated. When I was promoted to senior auditor at 29, my father introduced me at his Christmas party as his daughter who fixes computers. They had built me into a small, manageable disappointment, and they had needed me to stay there. The truth, of course, looked nothing like the version they were broadcasting. I worked out of a glass tower in Midtown Atlanta and pulled in a 6-figure salary auditing offshore financial structures for global clients. I had built a quiet, deliberate life. A modest 1-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood, a small but stable retirement account, a savings cushion that did not impress anyone at the country club, but that I had earned every dollar of through 15 years of 3 jobs at a time, predatory student loans, and night shifts I had worked while my sister was at frat parties on the other side of the country. I had stopped trying to correct my parents' version of me when I was 25, because I had finally realized they were not misinformed. They were committed. The lie was useful to them, in ways I did not yet fully understand on the night of that anniversary dinner. I drove home from the restaurant in Buckhead alone that evening, with the cold smile still resting somewhere underneath my professional composure. I did not cry in the car the way I would have at 25. I did not call my best friend the way I would have at 28. I sat in my apartment with the lights off for almost 40 minutes, drinking a glass of water and turning my father's voice over in my head from every possible angle. "You are not part of us." He had said it the way a CEO terminates a junior analyst, cleanly, without apology, in front of witnesses. By the time I went to bed that night, I had already decided that the next time I stepped inside the Whitlock estate, I was not going to be entering it as a daughter. I was going to be entering it as an auditor with a job to do. The aggressive pounding on my apartment door began at exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops on my block. I opened the heavy wooden door in my bathrobe and found my mother standing in the hallway in a pristine taupe pantsuit, her makeup already perfect, her expression already arranged into a scowl that deepened when she saw the casual fabric I was wearing. She did not greet me, she did not apologize for the hour. She lifted her arm and threw a heavy brass keyring directly at my chest, with enough force that I caught it on pure reflex, the jagged edges of the keys biting a small angry mark into the soft skin of my palm. "I want you over at the house in the next 30 minutes, she announced, pushing past me into my modest living room and surveying the space like an unhappy landlord conducting an inspection. "Your father just purchased a top-of-the-line smart home security system," she said, peering at the small kitchen counter where I had left a single coffee mug from the night before. New cameras for the exterior, a complete network upgrade, a high-end wireless router, the entire setup. He wants the whole thing installed and fully operational before we leave for the international terminal on Friday morning. So I need you to drive over there today and handle the installation. I held the keys in my open palm and looked at her without saying anything for several seconds. "You drove across the city at 7 in the morning, I said evenly, to order me to install your home security system." She rolled her eyes the way she had been rolling her eyes at me since I was 11 years old. "Do not make this dramatic, Sloane," she sighed. "You are going to be sitting in this little apartment babysitting all week anyway. We need to be able to log into the cameras from our private villa in Maui and check on the property while we are gone," she continued, smoothing an invisible wrinkle on her sleeve. "We also want to be able to check in on you, since you will be hosting our grandchildren. And honestly, you sit at a desk staring at screens all day for that boring little computer job of yours. You should know how to plug in a few cameras without making a project out of it." I gripped the cold metal of the brass keyring a little harder and felt the corners press into my palm without changing the expression on my face. The way she said boring little computer job, I understood, was exactly the same tone in which she had once told the country club I had chosen a sad technical field. To my parents, any career that did not involve real estate development, high finance, or a glossy job title that fit cleanly onto a country club name tag was a personal failure. What she did not know, standing in my living room in her perfectly tailored pantsuit and dismissing 15 years of my career in 2 sentences, was that the daughter she was about to send over to her house to plug in some consumer-grade security equipment was one of the most expensive forensic auditors a corporation could legally hire. Major banks paid my firm 7-figure retainers specifically to have me dismantle their network architecture and find the holes a sophisticated attacker would slip through. I had spent the previous year inside the financial systems of 3 separate Fortune 500 companies, tracing offshore wire transfers, and writing the kind of reports that ended careers and triggered federal indictments. Installing a 5-camera residential security kit was, professionally speaking, an insult so basic I might as well have been asked to alphabetize her spice rack. But I just smiled at her, gave nothing away, and told her I would handle everything. She left without thanking me, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood of my hallway as she marched back toward the elevator. I stood in my doorway holding the brass keyring and watched her disappear, and I felt something quiet and deliberate click into place inside my chest. For 15 years I had been the daughter who said yes. The daughter who drove across town on no notice. The daughter who fixed problems no one else wanted to fix and was thanked with a closed door. Today, for the first time in my life, I was going to say yes to my mother's demand and use the access she had just personally placed in my hand to walk through every single locked door inside that house. I showered slowly. I dressed in jeans and a plain navy shirt, the kind of forgettable clothing that lets a person move through a wealthy household without being remembered. Into a black canvas bag I placed the boxed security cameras my mother had left in the hallway, a small toolkit, a coil of fresh Ethernet cable, and 3 items she would not have recognized if she had pawed through the bag herself. A hardened laptop loaded with the same forensic suite I used on corporate engagements. a compact network analyzer the size of a paperback book, and a metallic encrypted flash drive, slim and matte gray, that I clipped onto the inside lining of the bag with a small magnetic catch. I had carried that flash drive into the offices of 3 Fortune 500 general counsels in the previous 18 months. I had never once carried it into my parents' house. The Whitlock estate sat at the end of a long private drive in one of the oldest gated enclaves in Buckhead, behind iron gates that my father had paid to have custom forged with the family monogram. I keyed myself through the side entrance using the brass ring my mother had thrown at my chest, and the alarm panel in the mudroom chirped politely as I disarmed it. The house was empty. My parents were at the country club for their standing Tuesday brunch. I had roughly 4 hours before either of them returned. I set my canvas bag down on the marble island in the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water from their filtered tap, and walked slowly through the first floor, taking inventory the way I would have taken inventory of a corporate headquarters on the first morning of an engagement. The home office was on the second floor, behind a heavy walnut door my father always kept closed. I let myself in. The desk was a slab of polished black walnut the size of a small car, flanked by 2 monitors and a desktop tower my father had bought because the salesman at the electronics store had told him it was the most powerful model on the floor. I sat down in his leather chair, set my laptop beside his keyboard, and woke the desktop. The login screen asked for a password. I smiled, because I had already guessed it 3 days earlier, when I had first started running this scenario in my head, on the drive home from Buckhead. Garrison 1962 Whitlock Holdings. His birth year and his company name, with a single capital letter at the start of each word, the way every middle-aged executive in America who had never once read a security briefing chose his passwords. I typed it in on the second attempt. The desktop unlocked. A rookie mistake from a man who had spent 40 years assuming nobody he cared about was ever going to be looking. I worked methodically. I started with the obvious places, the documents folder and the desktop, and found nothing more interesting than a few country club committee agendas and a folder of golf course photographs. I moved deeper. I pulled up his email client and scrolled past the surface layer of dinner invitations and real estate newsletters into the archived folders, where I found the first thing that did not belong. A folder labeled Landscaping Invoices, archived 11 years ago and never touched again, sitting at the bottom of a folder tree the average user would never voluntarily open. I clicked it. It did not contain a single landscaping invoice. It contained 412 wire transfer confirmations, organized by year, beginning 15 years earlier. I opened the most recent one. A wire transfer of $80,000, sent from an account I did not recognize through a Cayman Islands routing structure, into a holding account in the name of a company called Hale Innovations LLC. I knew that name. Tanner had been printing it on business cards for 3 years. I opened the next confirmation. $42,000, the previous month, same routing path, same destination. The one before that, $24,000, marked in the memo line with a single word, Villa. I sat very still in my father's leather chair and felt the temperature in the room drop the same 10 degrees I had felt at the anniversary dinner. I plugged the encrypted flash drive into the side of my laptop and began mirroring the folder in real time, every file copying across in cleanly indexed forensic snapshots, the metadata preserved, the timestamps preserved, the routing paths preserved. While the copy ran, I kept reading. The wire transfers were not random. They formed a pattern, and the pattern formed a portrait. $24,000 to a luxury airline 3 times a year, almost always in the month before a family vacation my parents had bragged about at the club. $42,000 to a villa management company in St. Bart's the summer. Bryn had posted photographs of herself in a white bikini on a private dock. $80,000 in a single transfer the autumn Tanner had announced his new technology venture and bought himself the gold Rolex. Every single transfer was sourced from the same Cayman holding account. None of the transfers were sourced from any account that bore my father's name. I leaned back in the leather chair and let my eyes close for a moment because I already knew what I was about to find, and I needed 3 full breaths before I went looking for it. Whose money was funding 15 years of first-class suites, private villas, $80,000 vacations, and a brother-in-law's fraudulent shell company, whose money had built the lie that the Whitlock family was wealthy enough to host 4 villas in Maui, whose money was sitting underneath every smug toast my father had ever offered at a country club dinner. I opened my eyes and went hunting for the trust charter. It took me 40 minutes. He had buried it deeper than the wire transfers, inside a folder labeled Property Tax Records 2009, inside a subfolder labeled Personal, behind a password-protected PDF, whose password turned out to be the same string I had already used to unlock the desktop. The document opened on my screen in pale gray scanned ink. The header read, in formal serif type, Declaration of Irrevocable Offshore Trust, established under the laws of the Cayman Islands, executed on a date I recognized as falling 6 weeks before my grandfather's death. Grandpa Wallace Whitlock had never been a sentimental man. He had been a quiet, careful man who had built a small fortune in commercial real estate and who had said what he meant exactly once and then expected you to remember it. His love had never arrived in words. It had arrived, all of it, in legal instruments, in trust documents, in the careful architecture of protection he had built around the people he believed in. I scrolled down to the beneficiary line. The name on the primary beneficiary of the offshore trust was Sloane Elizabeth Whitlock. My name. Mine. Not my father's, not Bryn's, not the family generally. Mine. Alone. In the unmistakable serif type of a Cayman Islands trust attorney who had been instructed by my grandfather, 6 weeks before his death, to place the entire offshore architecture of his fortune into the protection of his younger granddaughter. The trust had been seeded at the time of execution with $3,200,000. It had been structured to grow undisturbed, under professional management, until I reached the age of 30. On my 30th birthday, 3 years ago, it should have unlocked into my sole control. I had received nothing on my 30th birthday. Not a card, not a phone call, not a single sentence from anyone in my family acknowledging that a date had passed. I scrolled back up to the top of the document with hands that I noticed, distantly, were no longer perfectly steady. I read the trust charter from the first line to the last, and then I opened a second file, sitting in the same folder, a scanned letter on my father's personal letterhead, dated 2 weeks after my grandfather's funeral. In it, my father informed an extended family member who had inquired about the trust that the offshore structure had unfortunately been wiped out in the 2008 housing crash, that nothing remained, that Grandpa Wallace had unfortunately overextended himself in his final years, and that the family was simply going to have to absorb the loss and move forward. The 2008 housing crash had not touched the trust. The trust had been executed 5 years before 2008. The trust had been structured specifically by a grandfather who had lived through 3 recessions to be immune from any domestic market collapse. The lie was so casual it had not even been carefully built. He had told it because he had assumed nobody who mattered would ever look. I sat in my father's leather chair in the second-floor office of the Whitlock estate, with my grandfather's signature glowing on the screen in front of me, and I thought about every birthday I had paid for myself. Every textbook I had bought used because I could not afford new. Every shift I had worked at the campus coffee shop at 5 in the morning before an 8 a.m. exam. The predatory private student loan I had signed at 19 because my parents had told me there was simply no money to help, that the family had been hit hard by the crash, that I would need to find my own way, the way real adults did. The studio apartment with the broken radiator I had lived in for 2 years after graduation. The 15-year-long, careful, deliberate construction of a life I had built one underpaid hour at a time, while in a folder labeled Property Tax Records 2009, on a desktop computer protected by my father's birth year, $3,200,000 in my own name, had been quietly bled out, wire by wire, into first-class suites and private villas and a brother-in-law's fake company. I did not cry. I did not stand up. I did not move at all for a long time. I reached forward, very slowly, and pressed the small button on the side of the encrypted flash drive that confirmed the mirror was complete. The indicator light blinked once, green, and went dark. I did not move from my father's leather chair for another full hour. I worked. The forensic suite on my laptop was already indexing every file on the desktop in the background, and I let it run while I went looking for the one document I knew had to exist somewhere in the architecture of the theft. A trust executed in the Cayman Islands, naming a specific living beneficiary, could not simply be drained by a third party. Not legally, not without an instrument that gave that third party the authority to act on the beneficiary's behalf. Somewhere in this house, on this machine, or in a filing cabinet downstairs, there had to be a piece of paper that explained how Garrison Whitlock had convinced a Cayman trust administrator to release $3 million of his daughter's money into accounts she had never seen. I found it inside a folder labeled Insurance Renewals, archived in the same deep tree as the trust charter, behind the same lazy password. The document was a scanned PDF on the letterhead of a small estate law firm in suburban Atlanta, dated exactly 1 week after my 18th birthday. The title across the top read, in clean legal serif, Durable Power of Attorney, granting full and unrestricted financial authority over all offshore holdings and trust instruments held in the name of Sloane Elizabeth Whitlock to Garrison Whitlock, her father, effective immediately and continuing until revoked in writing by the principal. I scrolled down to the signature line. My signature was on the bottom of the page. I leaned closer to the screen because I needed to be absolutely certain of what I was looking at. The signature was a perfect replica. The loop on the capital S, the slight forward tilt of the L, the small flourish on the final K that I had developed in high school and never once changed. Whoever had drawn that signature had studied the real one carefully. They had practiced. The ink weight was consistent. The pen pressure looked natural. To a Cayman trust administrator reviewing a notarized document from an American law firm, it would have looked exactly like the signature of an 18-year-old woman granting her father control of her grandfather's money. I had never signed that document. I had never seen that document. 1 week after my 18th birthday, I had been 600 miles away at orientation week at a state university, eating cafeteria pasta and worrying about a calculus placement exam. My father had been in his office in Buckhead with a forged piece of paper and a notary stamp from a friend of a friend, executing the legal instrument that would let him bleed his dead father's protective architecture for the next 15 years. I mirrored the document onto the flash drive. I mirrored the notary's seal. I mirrored the law firm's letterhead and the metadata embedded in the PDF. I cross-referenced the notary's name against the public Georgia notary database in a separate browser window and confirmed that the notary in question had surrendered his commission in 2011 after a separate forgery complaint that had been quietly settled out of court. Every detail I needed was already in front of me. Every detail a federal prosecutor would want was already in front of me. I moved from the trust documents into the wire transfers and began the second, harder phase of the audit. I needed to know exactly how much money had been moved, where it had gone, and what was left. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and began entering the wire confirmations one at a time, building a clean ledger from the 412 transactions in the landscaping folder. The numbers grew faster than I had expected. By the time I reached the third year of transfers, I had already crossed $700,000. By the time I reached the 8th year, I had crossed $1,800,000. By the time I reached the most recent transfer, the $80,000 that had bought Tanner's Rolex, I had a working total of $2,940,000 hemorrhaged out of the offshore trust in 15 years. The trust had been seeded with $3,200,000. With professional management and standard market growth, it should have been worth somewhere between $7 and $9 million by the time I turned 30. Instead, the principal had been drained to a remainder of roughly $260,000, and even that remainder was scheduled, based on the trajectory of the wires, to be gone inside 18 months. I sat back in the leather chair and breathed out slowly through my nose. Then I did the one thing my father would never have anticipated, because it required a skill set he did not believe his disappointing daughter possessed. I opened a terminal window on my hardened laptop, wrote a small custom monitoring script in about 20 minutes, and pushed it quietly into the background of his desktop operating system. The script was invisible to any consumer-grade antivirus tool. It logged every email he sent or received, every file he opened, every login attempt against any financial portal, and every wire transfer he initiated, and it forwarded all of it in real time to an encrypted server I controlled. From this moment forward, Garrison Whitlock could not open his banking app without me watching him do it. The digital trap was set, and he was already inside it. I had just finished cleaning the keyboard with a soft cloth when I heard a heavy car door slam in the circular drive below the office window. I crossed to the glass and looked down. A matte black luxury SUV had pulled in behind my mother's sedan. The driver's door opened and Tanner stepped out, dressed in pastel golf clothing, pulling a set of monogrammed leather golf clubs out of the back hatch. He had let himself onto the property with the gate code, the way he always did, because in this family, Tanner was treated like a son, and I was treated like a contractor. I closed the laptop, slid it into my canvas bag, and walked downstairs at an unhurried pace, the brass keyring jingling softly in my pocket, alongside the metallic flash drive. By the time I reached the front foyer, Tanner was already inside, leaning his golf bag against the antique entryway console, without asking permission, and surveying me from my shoes upward, with the same expression of mild disgust he had worn at the anniversary dinner. He did not greet me. He looked at my jeans and my plain navy shirt, and he made a small, amused sound in the back of his throat. "Jesus, Sloane," he said, shaking his head. "You really do dress like the help. Garrison said you were over here installing the cameras. Try to actually finish before Friday, will you? Because the whole point is for us to be able to check on you from the villa." I smiled at him with the exact same ice-cold expression I had used at the dinner table the night before. "Of course," I said. "I am almost done." He grunted, walked past me into the kitchen, and helped himself to a sparkling water from the refrigerator without offering me one. I watched him cross the marble floor in his expensive golf shoes, and noted, with the calm, professional interest of a woman watching a target make a critical mistake, the soft chime of his phone connecting automatically to my parents' home wireless network. The network whose router I had personally just finished reconfiguring as part of the security upgrade. The network whose traffic was now passing through a small additional piece of hardware sitting quietly inside the utility closet, mirroring every packet to the same encrypted server that was already logging my father's keystrokes. Tanner stood in the kitchen scrolling through his phone for the next 40 minutes, sending emails, opening apps, logging into accounts, and answering messages, while I stood 20 feet away in the foyer pretending to align a camera bracket and watching, on my laptop screen propped on the entryway console, every single packet of his traffic decrypt itself in real time. What I saw made my hand still on the camera bracket. Hale Innovations LLC, the technology venture my father had toasted at the anniversary dinner as absolutely incredible, was a Delaware shell company with a registered agent address that resolved to a strip mall mailbox in Wilmington. It had filed no tax returns in 3 years. It had no employees. It had no revenue. What it did have was 4 separate lines of credit from 3 different predatory private lenders, totaling just over $4 million in outstanding debt, all of it personally guaranteed by Tanner Hale and cross-collateralized against assets that did not actually exist. He was not a tech founder. He was a man drowning in fraudulent debt, kept afloat month after month by wire transfers from a Cayman holding account that my father had been bleeding from my grandfather's trust to subsidize a fake millionaire son-in-law's performance for the country club. Tanner finished his sparkling water, dropped the empty bottle on the marble counter for someone else to throw away, picked up his golf clubs, and left without saying goodbye. I waited until I heard the SUV pull through the gate. Then I sat down on the bottom step of the curved staircase and opened the most recent email I had just pulled off his phone. The email was 3 days old. The sender was a private lender in Houston, Texas. The subject line read, in plain text, Re. Whitlock Austin Property, Final Terms. I opened it. The lender was offering a $2 million hard money loan against a commercial property in Austin, Texas, currently held in the name of Garrison Whitlock. The property was the last significant asset in my father's personal portfolio that had not already been quietly pledged against something else. The loan terms were aggressive, the interest rate was predatory, and the closing was scheduled for the morning after the family's arrival in Maui. The closing was not happening in Houston. The closing was happening in Honolulu, at the office of the lender's regional representative, at 9 in the morning on Saturday. The entire family vacation was a cover. The villas and the chefs and the sunset cruises were set dressing for a closing meeting, at which my father intended to leverage his last untouched commercial asset for $2 million in immediate cash, which would then be wired, the email made perfectly clear, into the same Cayman holding account that had been feeding Tanner's fraudulent shell company for the previous 15 years. The Austin property was not in my name, but it was the last clean asset in the entire Whitlock financial architecture. Once it was pledged against this loan, and once that loan defaulted, which it absolutely would, every other creditor in the system would move at once. The family would lose everything inside 90 days, and the $2 million, the actual cash, would already have been routed offshore through accounts that even a federal investigator would need 18 months to unwind. My father was not just stealing from me anymore. He was preparing to set fire to the last standing piece of the empire on his way out, and he was using a family vacation to launder the timeline. I closed the laptop very gently. If you are watching this, and you have ever discovered that the people who told you there was no money to help you were quietly burning a fortune that belonged to you, please take 1 second right now and hit the subscribe button, because the next chapter is the one where she stops watching and starts moving. In the comments, tell me the moment you realized the family story you had been told your entire life was a lie someone had built on purpose. 1 sentence is enough. I drove home from the estate that afternoon at exactly the speed limit, with the flash drive zipped into the inside pocket of my jacket and a folded printout of the Houston lender's email in the glove compartment. I did not allow myself to feel anything yet. There would be time for feelings later, on a balcony, with an ocean in front of me and a coffee in my hand, and none of these people anywhere in my life. For now, there was only the work. The farewell dinner the next evening was held at the estate, in the formal dining room under the enormous crystal chandelier my grandfather had paid to ship over from Vienna in 1978. I arrived in a soft cream blouse and dark slacks, my hair pulled back, the metallic flash drive clipped into the inside pocket of my slacks, where the weight of it pressed lightly against my hip every time I sat down. I smiled at my father when he opened the door. I complimented my mother on the floral arrangements. I asked Bryn how the packing was going. I played the obedient daughter so cleanly that my mother actually rested her hand on my forearm at one point during the salad course, and told me, in a voice that was meant to sound warm, that she was glad I was finally being mature about the trip. After dinner, Bryn pulled me upstairs to her childhood bedroom, which my mother still kept made up for her, and informed me that she had not finished packing and that I was going to help. For 2 hours I folded her resort dresses, her swimsuits, her 3 pairs of designer sandals, the silk pajama set she had bought specifically for the villa, and her children's tiny linen vacation outfits, while she lay on the bed scrolling through her phone and narrating which items were not to be wrinkled. She did not thank me. She did not look at me. At one point she handed me a stack of her husband's polo shirts and told me to fold them the way the dry cleaner did, because Tanner was particular. The flash drive pressed against my hip the entire time. I folded every shirt perfectly. I left the estate at 10 p.m. with a smile and a wave, and a promise to be at the house at 6 the next morning to receive the children. I drove directly downtown, into the financial district, to a glass tower whose lobby I had walked through exactly twice in my life. The directory in the elevator listed Vance & Associates, Federal White-Collar Defense and Plaintiff Recovery, on the 42nd floor. I had called Roman Vance from a private line that afternoon, after closing my laptop in my father's leather chair, and I had described the file I was bringing him in 3 sentences. He had cleared his calendar for our meeting before I had finished the 3rd one. Roman Vance was waiting for me in the lobby of his own firm at 10:45 at night, in a charcoal suit with no tie, holding a glass of bourbon and wearing the kind of small, predatory smile I had seen exactly once before in my career, on the face of a federal prosecutor who had just been handed a 5-year racketeering case wrapped in a bow. He was somewhere in his early 50s, lean, gray at the temples, with the unhurried physical stillness of a man who had spent 20 years watching wealthy defendants try to lie their way out of indictments, and had learned to enjoy the silence before they realized they were not going to succeed. He shook my hand once, firmly, and walked me back to his corner office without small talk. I set the flash drive on the polished marble surface of his desk between us. He plugged it into a sealed forensic workstation, not his own machine, and began scrolling through the index I had prepared. He read for 22 minutes without speaking. He read the trust charter. He read the forged power of attorney. He read the 412 wire confirmations. He read the email from the Houston lender and the closing schedule for the meeting in Honolulu. He read Tanner's debt structure and the shell company filings. When he reached the end, he sat back in his chair, took a slow sip of his bourbon, and looked at me across the marble desk with that same small predatory smile. "Miss Whitlock," he said quietly, "this is the cleanest fraud package I have ever been handed by a private citizen." He set the bourbon glass down. "We are going to file an emergency ex parte motion in federal court for a temporary restraining order and an asset freeze, naming your father, your mother, your sister, your brother-in-law, Hale Innovations LLC, the Houston lender, and 3 separate Cayman holding entities. I will have the motion drafted, signed by a federal judge I know personally, and ready to serve by tomorrow afternoon. The injunction will freeze every account, every line of credit, and every credit card connected to any named party, simultaneously, the moment it is served." I looked at him steadily across the desk. "I want it to drop," I said, "at the exact moment they sit down in the first-class departure lounge on Friday morning. Not before, not after." Roman Vance smiled a little wider, and for the first time in 15 years I felt something inside my chest that was very close to peace. "That," he said, "is exactly the strike I was about to recommend." We worked until 2 in the morning. By the time I left his office, the motion was drafted, the supporting exhibits were indexed, the federal judge had been quietly briefed by phone, and the timing of the strike had been mapped to the minute against the airline's published departure schedule. Roman walked me to the elevator himself, shook my hand again, and told me to sleep, because the next 48 hours were going to require me at full operational capacity. I slept 4 hours. At 6 a.m. on Friday morning, the doorbell of my apartment rang. I opened the door in clean professional clothes, with my hair already done and my makeup already on, and found Bryn and Tanner standing in the hallway with 3 tired children, 4 overstuffed backpacks, and a printed sheet of paper that Bryn held out to me without saying good morning. "This is the chore list," she said, in the bored, sweet voice she used when she was being publicly cruel. "Lily needs her allergy medication twice a day, the boys cannot have any sugar after 4, and I need the kitchen mopped, the laundry done, and the guest bathroom deep cleaned before we get back." Tanner did not even look at me. He was already walking back toward the SUV, phone pressed to his ear, talking to someone in Honolulu about a 9 a.m. meeting on Saturday. I took the chore list from Bryn's hand. I smiled at the children, who looked up at me with the tired, confused expressions of kids who had been packed and unpacked from a luxury SUV at dawn. "Have a wonderful flight," I said softly. Bryn was already walking away. I closed the apartment door behind Bryn and Tanner and stood in the entryway with 3 children looking up at me, each of them holding a small backpack and wearing the slightly confused expression of kids who had been told they were going to spend a boring week with their boring aunt. The oldest, a 9-year-old girl, was already eyeing the modest living room with the polite disappointment of a child who had been raised inside marble foyers. The 2 younger boys, 6 and 4, were holding hands without realizing they were doing it. I knelt down so my face was level with theirs. "Here is what is actually going to happen today," I said gently. 2 very nice women are going to be here in about 30 minutes. Their names are Annika and Maribel. They are professional nannies, and they are going to take all 3 of you to a hotel that has a giant indoor water park, room service ice cream, and a private play suite with every toy you have ever seen on the internet. You are going to have the best week of your entire lives. Does that sound okay? The 4-year-old's eyes went enormous. The oldest girl looked at me for a long, careful second, the way children look at adults when they are deciding whether to trust them, and then she nodded once. I had called the agency the previous afternoon, from my father's leather chair, after I had finished mirroring the trust documents. The agency was the same one used by visiting executives and traveling diplomats. Annika Lindgren was Swedish, in her late 30s, with 15 years of high net worth childcare experience and a background in early childhood education. Maribel Cortez was a former pediatric nurse who had transitioned into private nannying 8 years earlier. The two of them together cost more for 1 week than my mother had ever spent on me in a year. I had paid the entire fee in advance, out of my own legitimately earned savings, without hesitating for a single second. Whatever was about to happen to the adults in this family, the children were not going to be inside the blast radius. Annika and Maribel arrived at 6:45 in matching Navy uniforms, with a discreet black SUV waiting at the curb. They introduced themselves to the children with the warm, unhurried calm of women who had done this 1,000 times. Within 10 minutes, the kids were laughing. Within 15, they were buckled into the SUV, with their backpacks and a small cooler of organic snacks. Annika paused on the threshold before she followed them out and looked at me with the steady professional gaze of someone who had read the room without needing it explained. "We will keep them safe," she said quietly, "for as long as you need." I handed her a sealed white envelope, heavy linen stock, embossed with the hospitality brand of the 5-star hotel, where the suite was already booked under my name. Inside the envelope was the room key, the contact information for the on-call pediatrician, and a second, smaller envelope addressed in clean handwriting to Bryn Whitlock Hale, to be delivered at exactly the right moment later that morning. "Thank you," I said. The SUV pulled away from the curb at 6:58. I stood at my window and watched it disappear around the corner, and then I walked into my bedroom and began the transformation. I had laid the outfit out the night before. A tailored black suit cut precisely to my shoulders, the kind I wore to depositions. A crisp white silk blouse, low black heels designed for walking across marble floors without making any sound at all. My hair pulled back into a clean low knot, minimal makeup, sharpened only at the eyes. Into the inside pocket of the blazer, I clipped the metallic encrypted flash drive. Into the slim leather portfolio I placed 3 sealed manila envelopes, each one prepared by Roman Vance's office the previous night, each one bearing a federal court seal embossed into the upper right corner. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. The woman looking back at me was not the daughter in the simple charcoal dress at the far end of the mahogany table. She was the auditor. I picked up my car keys and walked out the door. The drive to Hartsfield-Jackson at 7:30 on a Friday morning took 40 minutes. I parked in the premium short-term garage attached to the international terminal, paid the daily rate on my own card without flinching, and rode the elevator up to the departures level with my leather portfolio under my arm. My phone buzzed once in my pocket as the elevator doors opened. I looked down at the screen. Roman Vance. 3 words. Judge signed. Standing by. I typed back 2 words. Wait for me. I walked through the international terminal at an unhurried professional pace. I cleared security with my premium traveler credentials in under 4 minutes. I rode the escalator up to the elevated concourse and walked the long polished corridor toward the airline's flagship first-class lounge, the one my father had been bragging about at country club dinners for years, as if he were the one who had earned access to it. The entrance was guarded by a single concierge desk, staffed by a woman in a perfectly tailored Navy uniform. I presented my own membership card, which I had quietly maintained for 3 years on my firm's corporate account, and which my parents did not know existed, and she smiled and welcomed me inside. The Whitlocks were already seated. I saw them before they saw me. My father was on a low leather sofa near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the tarmac, holding a glass of complimentary champagne and laughing at something one of my uncles had said. My mother was beside him in a cream traveling suit, scrolling through her phone with a small, satisfied smile. Bryn was on the opposite sofa with her legs crossed, wearing oversized sunglasses indoors, sipping a mimosa. Tanner was beside her in a navy blazer, leaning back with one arm slung along the cushions, his gold Rolex catching the morning light through the windows. Behind them, scattered across the surrounding seating area, were 6 other relatives, the same aunts and uncles who had refused to meet my eyes at the anniversary dinner. I walked directly toward them. My mother saw me first. Her smile collapsed in stages. The phone lowered slowly into her lap. She blinked at me twice as if she were trying to confirm I was real, and then her mouth opened slightly, and she nudged my father's arm without taking her eyes off me. My father looked up. His champagne glass paused halfway to his mouth. "Sloane," he said. His voice was not friendly. It was confused. The kind of confusion a man feels when an object he has filed away in a closed drawer reappears in the middle of his living room. "What are you doing here?" he said. "You are supposed to be at the apartment with the children." I did not answer. I walked past him, past my mother, past Bryn, past Tanner, and I stopped at the small marble-topped bar at the center of the lounge. I caught the bartender's eye and ordered a sparkling water with lime. I handed her my own personal credit card. She tapped it against the reader. The reader beeped once, politely, and printed a small receipt. Approved. I thanked her, picked up my glass, and turned to face my family. The entire lounge had quieted by a fraction. Other travelers, executives in expensive suits, a few discreet celebrities, a woman in a designer traveling coat reading a leather-bound book, had begun to glance over with the polite curiosity of people who had been raised to pretend they were not watching. I took a single sip of sparkling water. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," I said calmly. At that precise moment, the concierge at the entrance of the lounge walked across the carpeted floor with a small handheld tablet and a slightly apologetic expression. She approached my father first. "Mr. Whitlock," she said quietly, "I am very sorry to disturb you, but the airline is showing a problem with the payment method on file for your upgrade package. Would you mind providing an alternate card so we can resolve it before boarding?" My father laughed the easy laugh of a man who has never been told no by a service worker. "Of course," he said, reaching for his wallet. He pulled out his platinum card and handed it to her without looking. She tapped it against her tablet. The tablet made a small, soft sound. "I am very sorry, sir," she said, her voice professionally neutral. "This card has been declined. Do you have another?" My father blinked. He pulled out a second card. A black card with a metal weight to it, the kind the country club crowd carried specifically so it would make a sound when set on a bar. He handed it over. She tapped it. The same soft sound. "Also declined, sir." The lounge had gone genuinely quiet now. My father's face had begun to change color. He fumbled in his wallet and pulled out a third card, this one a corporate account from one of his real estate entities, and handed it across. The concierge tapped it against her tablet with the same calm professionalism. "I am very sorry, sir. This card is also showing as declined." Tanner stood up from the sofa abruptly, his face suddenly tight, and reached for his own wallet. "Let me handle this," he said, the false confidence in his voice cracking around the edges. He pulled out his own card, a flashy metallic thing he had bragged about at the anniversary dinner, and handed it to the concierge himself. She tapped it, the same soft sound. "Declined, sir." Bryn had pulled off her sunglasses. My mother had set her phone down on the cushion beside her, very carefully, the way a person sets down something that has become hot. My father turned to look at me, and for the first time in 33 years of my life, I saw something genuinely uncertain flicker across his face. I took another small sip of sparkling water. The concierge, sensing the temperature in the room, stepped back a polite distance. Tanner moved first, because Tanner always moved first when he was scared. He turned on my father with a sudden ugly snarl, the polished country club voice gone, replaced by something raw and panicked. "What the hell did you do, Garrison?" he hissed, his voice carrying across the now openly listening lounge. "You told me the wires cleared on Wednesday. You told me the Houston deal was locked. What did you do?" My father's head whipped toward him, and his own veneer cracked just as fast. "What I did," he snapped, his voice rising. "What I did was carry your fake company on my back for 3 years while you bought yourself a $50,000 watch and pretended to be a tech founder at every dinner party in Buckhead. Do not stand here in a public lounge and ask me what I did, Tanner. You know exactly where every dollar came from." A woman 2 sofas over set down her coffee very slowly. "It was you," Tanner shouted, the gold Rolex flashing as he jabbed a finger toward my father's chest. "You promised me the Austin closing would fund by Friday. You promised me the credit lines would hold through the trip. You knew Hale Innovations could not survive another month without that infusion. And you sat there at the anniversary dinner toasting my company like it was real." "It is not real," my father shouted back, completely losing the polished baritone now. "It has never been real. Your company is a shell, Tanner. The only thing keeping you in that house, and keeping Bryn in those shoes, is my father's money, and we are out of it." The word hung in the air of the lounge. My father's father, my grandfather, my money. Bryn made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, the sound of a woman who has just realized in public that the floor under her life is made of paper. She turned slowly toward me, sunglasses dangling forgotten from her hand, and her face contorted into something I had never seen on her before. "You," she breathed. "You did this. You did something. I do not know how, but you did something. You petty, jealous little—" She lunged across the gap between us, her open hand swinging toward my face with the practiced motion of a woman who had slapped her sister at least 4 times in their shared childhood and had never once been slapped back. I caught her wrist in midair, 6 inches from my cheek. I held it there, calmly, without anger, without effort. The wealthy travelers in the lounge had stopped pretending to read their books. The woman in the designer coat had set hers down entirely. I leaned in toward Bryn until our faces were a foot apart, and I spoke quietly enough that only she could hear me. "The Rolex on his wrist," I said softly, "was paid for with Grandpa Wallace's money. The villa in St. Bart's, paid for with Grandpa Wallace's money. The house you live in, the cars you drive, the private school the kids attend, the diamond bracelets that rattled at the anniversary dinner. All of it, Bryn. Every single piece of your life for the last 15 years was paid for out of a trust that had my name on the beneficiary line. You have been living inside my inheritance, and you never once asked where it came from." I let go of her wrist. It dropped to her side. She did not move. I turned away from her and walked the 3 steps to my mother, who was still sitting on the leather sofa, her phone forgotten beside her, her face the color of old paper. I did not say anything to her. I simply opened my leather portfolio, withdrew the first of the 3 manila envelopes, embossed with the federal court seal, and set it gently on the polished marble surface of the low table in front of her. I withdrew the second envelope and set it down in front of my father. I withdrew the third and set it down in the empty space between Bryn and Tanner. The federal documents made 3 small, identical sounds against the marble. "Temporary restraining order," I said, my voice perfectly even, perfectly carrying. "Asset freeze. Emergency ex parte injunction, signed at 1 a.m. this morning by a federal judge in the Northern District of Georgia. Every account, every line of credit, every credit card, every property held in any of your names is frozen as of 7 minutes ago. The Houston lender has been notified. The Honolulu closing has been canceled. The Cayman accounts have been flagged with FinCEN. The forged power of attorney, executed 1 week after my 18th birthday, is currently sitting on the desk of an assistant United States attorney who specializes in wire fraud and identity theft." My mother slid off the sofa. She did not stand. She did not steady herself. She slid forward onto her knees on the marble floor of the first-class lounge, in her cream traveling suit, in front of 24 wealthy strangers, and she began to crawl the short distance toward my feet, her hands outstretched, her face wet. "Sloane," she sobbed, her voice cracking open in a way I had not heard in my entire life. "Sloane, please. Family. We are your family. Please, we can fix this. Please, you do not understand. Your father, he did not mean, please, Sloane. Family. Family." I looked down at her. I let myself look for a long, calm second. Then I stepped around her, the way a person steps around a puddle, and I walked toward Bryn one last time. I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer and withdrew the small white envelope embossed with the hospitality brand of the luxury hotel. I held it out to her. Your children, I said quietly, are at this address. They are with 2 licensed professional nannies, in a private suite, with full access to the water park and 24-hour pediatric care. The booking is paid in full through the end of the week. They are completely safe. They will never know any of this happened. When you are finished being arrested, you can pick them up. Bryn took the envelope with a shaking hand. I turned around. I walked back across the lounge to the marble bar. I picked up my sparkling water, which was still cold. I took a small sip, and then I walked, at the same unhurried professional pace I had walked in with, past the concierge desk, past the floor-to-ceiling windows, past the silent dumbstruck travelers, and out into the long polished corridor of the international terminal. I did not look back. If you are watching this, and you have ever stood in a room full of people who finally understood who you actually were, please take 1 second right now and hit subscribe, because the last thing I want to show you is what the other side of that walk looks like. The aftermath moved with the unhurried inevitability of a tide. The federal indictment of Garrison Whitlock came down 11 weeks later, on 14 counts including wire fraud, identity theft, forgery of a notarized instrument, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. He took a plea deal to avoid trial. He is currently serving a 9-year sentence at a federal facility in eastern Kentucky. Margot Whitlock, named as a knowing co-conspirator on 6 of the counts, accepted a separate plea and is serving 4 years at a women's facility in Alabama. The Buckhead estate was seized and sold at auction. The country club quietly revoked their membership the same week the indictment was unsealed. Tanner Hale was indicted separately on 21 counts of bank fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering related to Hale Innovations LLC. He is awaiting trial and has been denied bond. The gold Rolex was seized as part of an asset forfeiture order during his 2nd week in custody. Bryn filed for divorce inside 30 days, retained a discount family attorney, and currently waits tables at a chain diner in suburban Marietta. She has not been allowed to contact me. The court order is mutual. The children are safe. They live with Bryn in a small rented apartment. I quietly funded a college trust for all 3 of them through a blind irrevocable instrument that Bryn cannot touch and does not know exists. Grandpa Wallace would have wanted that. The architecture of his protection extends to the next generation, the way he had designed it to. The remainder of the offshore trust, $260,000, was restored to my sole control inside 90 days. Roman Vance recovered an additional $1.1 million through civil clawbacks against the parties who had received the wires. The Austin commercial property, untouched, was transferred into my name as partial restitution. I kept my job. I was promoted to managing director 4 months after the indictment. My firm gave me a small private office with a window. 6 months later, I am sitting on the private balcony of a 5-star resort on the western coast of Maui. The villa is mine. I paid for it myself, in cash, out of my own legitimately earned money. Not the trust, not the restitution. The savings account I built one, underpaid hour at a time over 15 years. The one my parents never once asked about. The morning is soft. The Pacific is the kind of unreasonable blue that does not photograph correctly. There is a porcelain cup of coffee in my hand, made the way I like it, by a person I tipped well and thanked by name. My phone is in the villa, in a drawer, turned off. There is no one I need to call. I watch the ocean for a long time. Somewhere inside the architecture of legal instruments my grandfather built before he died, a quiet old man who never once told me he loved me in a sentence, I can feel him sitting beside me on this balcony. He had said it the only way he knew how. He had said it in a trust charter signed 6 weeks before his death, with my name on the beneficiary line, structured to survive every market collapse, every dishonest son, every forged signature, every 15-year campaign of theft. It had taken me 33 years to hear him. I take a slow sip of the coffee. The ocean keeps moving. I do not.